Okay, let's unpack this. I want to start this deep dive somewhere. Pretty interesting.
Eh.
In total, utter darkness. We're beneath the North American wetlands, and the star-nosed mole is hunting.
Ah, the star-nosed mole, a great example.
Right, and this animal finds its prey in just a fraction of a second, not with sight, but with its sense of touch.
That incredible star on its nose.
Exactly, this star-shaped cluster of appendages, and it's got something like 25,000 touch-sensitive receptors.
25,000. And that one fact, that encapsulates the whole mission of this deep dive, doesn't it?
But really,
Because we're connecting that sensory input, those receptors detecting pressure, to the final decisive action, the motor output.
so that's the goal here.
Yes, our mission is to give you the essential roadmap for this whole dense topic of sensory and motor mechanisms. Basically how animals detect things, process them, and then, move.
Bridging the gap between perception and action. So what's that foundational pathway? The four big steps common to pretty much everything.
It always starts at the input. Sensory receptors respond to a stimulus, which is always some form of energy, light, pressure, a chemical.
Right.
Second, that signal is transmitted to the central nervous system, the CNS. Third, the CNS decodes and processes it. And finally, the brain sends out motor commands for a motor output.
A muscle contraction, a gland secreting something.
Exactly.
Perfect. That sets the stage. So let's drill down into that first part. Sensation itself. Concept 50.1. We need to define the four core functions of any sensory pathway.
Okay, so first up is sensory reception. This is just the detection of the stimulus by specialized sensory cells.
Mm-hmm.
And the sensitivity can be just astounding. I mean, some light receptors can detect a single photon.
A single photon. Wow. Okay, so once that energy is detected, it has to be converted into the language of the nervous system. That's transduction, right?
Absolutely. Transduction is just converting that stimulus energy into a change in membrane potential. We call that a receptor potential.
And a receptor potential is a graded potential, meaning it's not all or nothing.
Exactly. Its size varies with the strength of the stimulus. A gentle touch gives you a small potential. A hard poke gives you a big one.
And if that potential is big enough, it hits the threshold and we get to step 3, transmission. So how does the brain tell the difference between the gentle touch and the hard poke?
This is so fundamental. Once you trigger an action potential, its size is fixed. It's all or nothing. So the intensity is coded by the frequency of the action potentials.
So a stronger stimulus means more action potentials firing more rapidly.
A whole rapid volley of them. That's the language of intensity.
Which brings us to the final, and I think the most surprising step, perception. How does the brain know if that stream of identical electrical signals is a flash of light or a high-pitched sound?
Here's the big aha moment. The brain knows the difference solely because of the path the signal traveled. An action potential is an action potential. But one arrives via the auditory nerve, the other via the visual nerve, and the brain perceives them completely differently.
So our whole perception of the world, color, taste, sound is really just an interpretation based on wiring.
It's a reconstruction, yeah, based purely on signal routing.
That's incredible. Okay, so before the signal even leaves the receptor, it can be modified. Amplification and adaptation.
Right. Amplification is just strengthening the signal. A lot of stimuli are really weak. So during transduction, enzyme cascades can boost the signal's power. The signal from your eye, for example, has about 100,000 times the energy of the photons that actually triggered it.
A huge power boost. And then there's sensory adaptation, which I think we're all thankful for.
We would be paralyzed without it. It's the decrease in responsiveness to a continuous stimulus. You put your clothes on, you feel them for a second, and then the sensation just fades away.
It saves us from total sensory overload.
Completely.
Okay, let's talk about the hardware, the 5 main categories of receptors. First up, mechanoreceptors.
These detect any kind of physical deformation, pressure, stretch, motion, sound. The classic example is the stretch receptor in your quad that triggers the knee-jerk reflex.
And for our star-nosed mole, all 25,000 of those receptors are mechanoreceptors.
Right, they let the brain build a complete touch map of its dark environment.
Next, chemoreceptors.
These are for molecules. So inside your body, osmoreceptors are tracking your blood's solute concentration. Externally, they can be phenomenally sensitive.
Like the silkworm moth example.
Exactly. The male moth's antenna can detect pheromones from a female several kilometers away. We're talking a detection limit close to a single molecule.
Unbelievable. Third category, electromagnetic receptors. light, electricity, magnetism.
The platypus is a fantastic example here. Its bill can sense the tiny electrical fields from the muscle contractions of its prey underwater.
And many animals use the Earth's magnetic field to navigate.
Sea turtles, birds. It's like a built-in compass.
Okay, fourth, thermoreceptors, heat and cold. And this one has my favorite fun fact.
I think I know which one you mean, the capsaicin one.
Yes. So the protein that detects dangerously high temperatures, say above 42 Celsius.
Is the exact same protein that's activated by capsaicin, the chemical that makes chili peppers hot.
So when you eat a hot pepper, you're not actually being burned.
Nope. The chemical is just tricking your heat-detecting pain receptor.
Which is a perfect lead-in to our fifth category, nociceptors, pain receptors.
Right. They detect anything noxious that could cause tissue damage, extreme pressure, temperature, certain chemicals. And when cells are damaged, they release things like prostaglandins, which actually make these receptors even more sensitive.
Which is why drugs like aspirin, which block prostaglandins, help reduce pain.
Precisely.
Okay, that wraps up the foundations. Let's move to hearing and equilibrium, concept 50.2, which is all about those mechanoreceptors in action.
We can start simple with invertebrates. Many of them use statocysts for balance. They're these little chambers with dense granules inside called statoliths.
And gravity just pulls them down, right?
Exactly. They settle on the bottom, stimulating hair cells there and telling the animal which way is up. There was a great experiment where researchers replaced a crayfish's statoliths with metal shavings.
Oh, I could see where this is going.
They used a magnet to pull the shavings to the top of the chamber, and the crayfish immediately flipped upside down, trying to correct its orientation.
That's brilliant. It proves the whole mechanism. Okay, for us, we have the ear. Sound waves hit the eardrum.
The tympanic membrane, yeah. Then in the middle ear, 3 tiny bones, the malleus, inculatus, and stapes, amplify those vibrations.
And they transmit them to the oval window of the inner ear.
Right. And that creates pressure waves in the fluid inside the coiled cochlea.
And inside the cochlea is where transduction happens. The waves vibrate the basilar membrane.
Yes. And sitting on that membrane are the mechanoreceptors of the ear, the hair cells. As the membrane moves, their little hairs bend against a stiff structure called the tectorial membrane.
And that bending is the stimulus.
It is. Bending one way depolarizes the cell, so you get more signal. Bending the other way hyperpolarizes it, you get less signal.
So the amplitude of that bending gives you volume. How does the ear tell the difference between pitch a high C versus a low C?
This is one of the most elegant designs in all of biology. It's about the physics of the basilar membrane itself. It's narrow and stiff near the beginning by the oval window.
Okay.
And it gets wider and more flexible as it goes deeper into the cochlea. High-frequency sounds make the stiff part vibrate. Low-frequency sounds make the flexible part vibrate.
So the brain perceives pitch based on where along the membrane the signal is coming from.
Exactly. Location, not frequency of input. It's another example of how the pathway is everything.
Fascinating. Okay, briefly, what about the other half of the inner ear for equilibrium?
Right, so you have the utricle and saccule. They detect linear acceleration and gravity. They have hair cells in a gel with these little calcium carbonate particles called otoliths.
Like the statoliths in the crayfish.
Very similar idea. When you tilt your head or accelerate in a car, the heavier otoliths shift and bend the hairs. Then you have the 3 semicircular canals for rotational movement.
One for each plane of motion.
Right. When you spin, the fluid inside them lags behind, pushing on a gelatinous cap called a cupula and telling your brain you're rotating.
And we should quickly mention that fish have a sort of external version of this, the lateral line system.
A perfect link. Yeah, they use hair cells in cupullae along their sides to detect water movement. It's like they're hearing with their whole body.
Which brings us to concept 50.3, vision.
What's amazing here is that all light detectors, from the simplest to the most complex, seem to share a common genetic origin for their photoreceptors.
You can see that in simple organisms like the planarian, the flatworm. It just has ocelli or eye spots.
They don't form an image. They just detect the direction of light, which is enough for the worm to move away from it and find shade.
Contrast that with an insect's compound eye.
A totally different level. Thousands of individual detectors called ommatidia, giving them this huge field of view and incredible motion detection. Plus, many of them see into the ultraviolet spectrum.
So for our model, the vertebrate eye, light is focused by the lens onto the retina. And the retina has 2 types of photoreceptors, rods and cones.
Rods are for night vision, very sensitive, black and white. Cones are for color vision. We have 3 types: red, green, and blue. And the fovea, the center of your sharpest vision, is just packed with cones.
Now we get to what you called the most counterintuitive mechanism we'll discuss, visual transduction.
Get your head around this one.
Oh.
In the dark, a rod cell is actually depolarized. It's constantly releasing the neurotransmitter glutamate.
So it's on in the dark.
It's on in the dark. When light hits the pigment rhodopsin, it triggers a cascade that closes sodium channels. The cell hyperpolarizes, it becomes more negative, and it stops releasing glutamate.
Wait. So light turns the cell off. The signal for light is the absence of a neurotransmitter signal.
Exactly. It seems completely backward, but allows for incredible sensitivity.
That is just wild. So after the photoreceptors, the signal goes to bipolar cells, then to ganglion cells, which form the optic nerve.
And on the way, the image gets sharpened by lateral inhibition. Basically, an active neuron tells its neighbors to quiet down, which enhances the contrast at edges.
And the nerve signals cross at the optic chiasm, so the left visual field goes to the right brain and vice versa.
Correct. And we have to mention the gene therapy research.
Right, the colorblind squirrel monkeys.
They injected the gene for the missing color pigment into adult monkeys, and it worked. It showed that the brain's neural circuits are plastic enough to learn how to interpret a new color signal, even in adulthood.
Amazing. Okay, let's move quickly to the chemical senses. Taste and smell, gustation and olfaction.
Right. And we should remember that what we call flavor is really the interaction of both.
So for taste, we have the 5 basics: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami.
Umami is that savory taste from glutamate. And there was a critical experiment here that confirmed the single receptor hypothesis.
Tell us about that one.
So researchers engineered mice to have the human bitter receptor on the cells that are supposed to detect sweet things.
Okay.
When they gave these mice a bitter chemical, the mice loved it. They drank it like it was sugar water.
Wow. So it proved that the brain's perception of taste depends only on which wire is activated, not what the chemical actually is.
It beautifully reinforces that core principle. The pathway determines the perception.
How do the different tastes work mechanistically?
Sweet, umami, and bitter all use complex G protein-coupled receptors, or GPCRs. Sour and salty are simpler. They use ion channels.
And for smell, the olfactory receptor cells are actually neurons themselves.
They are, and their axons go straight to the olfactory bulb in the brain. An odorant binds to a GPCR, triggers a cascade, opens ion channels, and creates an action potential.
And we can distinguish so many smells because we have hundreds of different types of these receptors.
Around 380 types. And each cell only expresses one type, and all the cells with the same type all wire to the same little spot in the olfactory bulb. It's like a map of smells.
All right, we've gathered all this sensory input. Time for the output, concept 50.5, muscle function.
This is where we turn electrical potential into physical action. We're looking at skeletal muscle, which is built like a set of Russian dolls. A muscle is made of fibers, which contain myofibrils, and those are made of the fundamental contractile unit, the sarcomere.
And the sarcomere is made of thin filaments, mostly actin, and thick filaments, which are myosin.
And they shorten the muscle using the sliding filament model. The key is the filaments themselves don't shorten, they just slide past each other.
Driven by the myosin heads grabbing and pulling. Let's walk through that myosin cycle.
Okay, it starts with a myosin head bound to ATP. Step 1, the ATP is split into ADP and phosphate, which cocks the head into a high-energy position.
It's primed.
Primed. Step 2, the head binds to actin, forming a cross bridge. Step 3, the release of that ADP and phosphate triggers the power stroke, the pull.
And then the crucial 4th step.
A new molecule of ATP has to bind to the myosin head to make it let go of the actin. ATP is required for the detachment, not just the pull.
That's why rigor mortis happens. No ATP, the muscles lock up because the heads can't detach. So what's the on-off switch for all this?
Calcium. In a resting muscle, a couple of regulatory proteins, tropomyosin and the troponin complex, are physically blocking the sites on actin where myosin wants to bind.
So the signal from the nerve has to move them.
Exactly. An action potential from a nerve cell travels down the muscle fiber's membrane and triggers the sarcoplasmic reticulum, or SR, to release a flood of calcium ions.
And the calcium is the key.
The calcium binds to the troponin complex, which yanks the tropomyosin out of the way, exposing the binding sites. Contraction begins. To relax, the cell just has to pump the calcium back into the SR.
And the nervous system controls the force of that contraction in 2 ways: recruitment and rate of stimulation.
A motor unit is just one neuron and all the muscle fibers it controls. To get a stronger contraction, you just recruit more motor units.
And If you stimulate a muscle fiber fast enough.
The individual twitches fuse together into one smooth, sustained contraction called tetanus.
And we also have different fiber types for different jobs.
For sure. You've got oxidative fibers, which are built for endurance. They use aerobic respiration, have tons of mitochondria, lots of blood supply, and a protein called myoglobin that makes them look red.
Marathoner's muscle.
Exactly. Then you have glycolytic fibers. They're bigger, they use glycolysis for quick energy, they have less myoglobin, so they're white muscle, and they fatigue really fast.
Sprinter's muscle.
Sprinter's muscle. And we also classify them by speed, as slow twitch or fast twitch.
Okay, let's wrap this all up with concept 50.6, skeletons and locomotion. Muscles have to pull against something.
And they work in antagonistic pairs. Your biceps contracts to bend your arm, your triceps contracts to straighten it.
There are a few types of skeletons. Let's start with hydrostatic skeletons.
Think of an earthworm. It's basically a fluid-filled tube. They move by squeezing that fluid around with rhythmic waves of contraction called peristalsis, but it can't support walking.
Then you have exoskeletons, like an insect shell, and our kind, endoskeletons.
Right. An exoskeleton is great for protection, but you have to shed it to grow. Our endoskeleton grows with us, and it's constantly being remodeled by bone-building osteoblasts and bone-resorbing osteoclasts.
And when it comes to locomotion, it's all about physics, overcoming friction and gravity.
For swimming, gravity isn't a big deal, but drag is, which is why you see that streamlined, torpedo-like fusiform shape in so many fish.
For movement on land, gravity is the huge challenge, so you need powerful muscles and strong support.
And some animals have brilliant energy-saving hacks. The kangaroo's tendons act like springs,
They store and release kinetic energy with each hop.
which dramatically reduces the metabolic cost of hopping. It's incredibly efficient.
So if we look at the big picture energy data comparing swimming, flying, and running, what's the takeaway?
The data is really clear. Running costs the most energy per unit of mass and distance. Flying is in the middle, and swimming is by far the most efficient.
And bigger animals are more efficient no matter how they move.
Exactly. A whale uses less energy per kilogram to move a meter than a minnow does. Same goes for an elephant versus a mouse.
That really brings us full circle. From a tiny touch receptor on a mole's nose to the physics of an elephant walking.
The core idea is that connection between specialized detection and coordinated action. We went from light hyperpolarizing a cell, that counterintuitive vision signal, to the elegant physics of pitch detection, all the way to the ATP-driven pull and release of a muscle filament.
So if the brain really does construct perception solely based on the path the signal travels, that big principle from the beginning, that leaves us with a really provocative thought. If a neuroscientist could somehow take your auditory nerve and reroute its signals into your visual cortex, would hearing a sound actually cause you to see a flash of light?
It raises some profound questions about what our sensory reality actually is and how malleable it might be.
Something to think about. Thank you so much for sharing your material with us. We hope this deep dive has given you some real clarity and insight.